How do we take then this balance of authenticity, this storytelling? Because a lot of times we are talking about people maybe standing on a stage or standing in a room full of people giving a presentation. But as you know, over the past few years, a lot of us are now doing more and more presentations in the virtual world, right? And we had Joe Navarro on the episode before. I think he's been on your podcast as well. And one of the key things that he talked about is how important body language still is, even in a virtual setting, right? Um, how do you take all of that and create a really great virtual presentation? Because I think a lot of people struggle with the fact that you're presenting, you can't really see the audience, you can't get a feel for their body language and have that feedback loop so that you know, well, okay, do I need to speed up? What do I do? Right? What tips do you have for someone who's really on a regular basis giving these virtual presentations or even on social media? Because I think presenting, doing videos for social media is a norm nowadays. So like, how can we take these presentation skills and transfer them really behind the screen now?
Yep, yep. And Joe, I know Joe Navarro. However, I hadn't had a pleasure yet of interviewing him. I interviewed Abby Maronio. You also interviewed Abby,
Yes.
her student. Maybe one day, Joe. Great. His book, "What Everybody Is Saying," is a great read. And okay, virtual communication. There are three key things to consider. Number one is, and these are key differences between online and in person. The first one is the setup and technology in general. Now, in person, the setup is not the most important thing to consider for obvious reasons. While we are online, even now, Brian, we're having this conversation online. The setup does make a difference. So make sure that you have a good setup in terms of webcam and microphone. We were talking about lighting before pressing record. These kind of things. The setup. The other thing is the level of interaction with the audience. Now, interacting with the audience is always important because any presentation should feel like a conversation for the audience. It shouldn't be a monologue. But research tells us that when you are presenting in person, the audience's attention will drop after about every 10 minutes or so. So it's as if every 10 minutes you need to buy the audience's attention back. And you can do that with a simple moment of interaction. It could be as simple as asking the audience a question which is connected to something you've just said, or it's connected to something you are planning to say next. And you need to do that more or less every 10 minutes if you are in person. Now, online, you said it, Brian, it's even harder to keep the audience's attention high. And so the 10-minute rule becomes the 3 to 5 minute rule. Very few people do it. But if you are presenting online and your presentation is longer than 3 or 5 minutes, then it means that every 3 to 5 minutes you need to create a moment of interaction with the audience. So that's another thing. And then from a delivery perspective, then the principles are the same, but the way you implement them is different. If we take eye contact, just to give you a practical example, it's the same principle. We want to make eye contact with people because that's one way to have a good connection with each other. Now, the way we make eye contact in person is very different from what we need to do online. Online, we need to look into the camera as much as possible because that's where the audience is. What do most people do instead? They look at the screen, they look at the slides, they look at themselves. But then if we do that, you miss out on the opportunity to make a good connection with the audience. So you need to look into the camera as much as possible. Now, what I do, for example, Brian, when it comes to eye contact online, I follow the 80-20 principle that works in any area of our lives. 80-20, which means that 80% of the time I look into the camera. And then 20% of the time, you said, for example, how do we read the room? If you look into the camera all the time, it will be impossible for you to understand, to get those signals that you do need to understand to be able to see whether your message is landing well. So 20% of the time, then I look at my screen, I could look at my notes, I could look at myself, 80-20. And that's just one. I'll give you another practical example. If you think about hand gestures, now, the more you move your hands, the more, within certain limits, of course, the more dynamic you will be. So you can become a more dynamic speaker, presenter with your hand movements. Online, though, depending on your setup, sometimes you may need to move your hands a little bit higher than you would normally do in a face-to-face presentation. So for those who are watching or will be watching the video recording here, if I move my hands here in person, I would never do that. That feels weird. So for those who are just listening, I have my hands very close to my chin. That would be weird. But if it's online, then if you are using your hands, you need to make sure that they are visible. So not always, but from time to time, you need to keep them a little bit higher than you would normally do in a face-to-face presentation. So again, the principles are the same. The way you apply them may differ if you are online.
Hey, if you're getting value from today's conversation, make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss any future episodes of the Aspire to Inspire podcast.